Los Angeles punk band Descendents had just invented a new concoction that allowed them to play faster and more aggressively than ever before. This concoction consisted of 10 scoops of instant coffee mixed with as little water as possible, forming a highly caffeinated sludge. The band realized that upon drinking this thick, grainy liquid, it would send them into punk overdrive, allowing them to achieve a ridiculously fast tempo whilst playing emotionally charged songs that would eventually inspire pop punk, a genre that still seems to linger within the mainstream to this day. When exploring the personalities of the band members at the time, it's easy to understand why Coffee Sludge would be their vice of choice, although it's difficult to picture them as the punk rock legends that would eventually inspire the likes of NoFX, Dave Grohl and Blink-182. The band consisted of a drummer who regularly stunk of halibut during performances due to consistent fishing trips, a nerdy frontman with glasses so thick he could barely see the crowd, a guitarist with so much angst he would break down into existential crisis whilst on stage, and a bassist in his mid-30s that would perform with outcast teenagers in between his day job as a mailman. It seems that much like the caffeinated sludge, this concoction of weirdos sparked an emotion that would resonate with countless individuals throughout the 80s and during the decades since. If you were to take a time machine back to 1977 and interact with the eventual drummer and mastermind behind Descendents, Bill Stevenson, it would be difficult to imagine that the chubby kid in front of you, dressed in fishing overalls and chuckling at the sound of his own farts, would eventually play for the likes of Black Flag and essentially invent an entire genre with his band Descendents. His interest in punk music would actually begin around this time, as he began to work for a shop named the Hermosa Tackle Box. It just so happened that the son of Bill's employer was Keith Morris, eventual frontman for bands such as Black Flag and Circle Jerks. Bill had become sick of top 40 chart music at the time and asked Morris what kind of music he should be listening to. Morris would begin showing him more underground music like punk and surf rock, specifically the band The Last. The Last had formed a year earlier and played fast-paced surf and psychedelic rock. What Bill didn't realize at the time was that the bassist from The Last had just formed a band alongside classmate Frank Nevada, with the new band being given the purposely misspelt name Descendents. Although Frank, David and Bill all went to the same high school and shared various classes, Bill became fanatically obsessed with The Last and newly formed Descendents, specifically The Last's drummer, inspiring him to pick up the drums himself and eventually record over demo cassettes Frank and David had produced together intended for Descendents. Although Bill was a weirdo and stunk of fish consistently, David knew he had the right energy and personality to be in a band, and upon hearing the demo Bill had dubbed over, knew that he was the perfect drummer for Descendents. Although at the time the band primarily played music that fit more into a surf rock vibe, they began to see elements of the teen angst they would eventually become known for, mainly inspired by Frank Nevada's songwriting. Frank had a natural bitterness at the world around him, stemming from a dysfunctional family situation growing up. This quickly leaked into the songs, with Frank outwardly exploring his envy towards people that were more successful or better looking than him. Although the trio enjoyed playing together at the time, David and Nolte didn't have enough time to focus on both The Last and Descendents, and therefore decided to focus on the former, leaving Descendents without a bassist. Luckily, as if it was fate, Bill would be taken out the rubbish not long after Nolte's departure, and saw a bass guitar sticking out of his neighbour's bin. He would quickly snatch it and start writing songs on the instrument that at the time was actually missing 2 strings. The first song he wrote was the eventual Myage. There was just one issue: Bill couldn't play drums and bass at the same time. This type of motherfucker hadn't been invented yet, so the band still needed to find a new bass player. Their saving grace would come in the form of a 34-year-old mailman named Tony Lombardo. Whilst rehearsing, Frank would hear somebody playing bass down the street. This prompted the group of friends to follow the source of the sound to find out who was playing. They were greeted with Tony practicing his bass within his garage, which subsequently led to Frank asking Tony if he would like to jam together. He would agree, and after finding jamming with the teenagers thrilling, would join Descendents as their new bassist. At the time, Tony was 34, with Frank and Bill being just 15 years old. A few years earlier, punk had become a mainstream force within the United Kingdom, with many of the trends beginning to leak its way into the United States. This led to flourishing punk and hardcore scenes. This inspired Tony, who brought the idea of playing more punk-focused music to the rest of the bandmates. This style of fast-paced, aggressive music fit perfectly with not just the rampant nature of the band members, but Frank's angsty-filled style of songwriting. They quickly found a formula that worked and began playing a few local shows around the area. Members of the local punk scene at the time were incredibly confused when viewing the way Descendents presented themselves. They completely avoided the traditional punk rock style, which ironically consisted of clothing that was far too expensive for most punks to afford at the time, resulting in Descendents just wearing regular clothes or fishing overalls instead. The way the trio acted was also unusual. Drummer Bill was incredibly energetic and immature. Guitarist Frank would play so hard and fast that his trousers would regularly fall down on stage, and bassist Tony was just a 34-year-old man and obviously exhibited much more maturity than the other teenage band members, but was probably a lot more immature than other 34-year-old male men. The band released their first single in 1979, with Frank and Tony splitting vocal duties. As the band's complexity, technicality and speed began to grow, Frank and Tony became sick of singing and instead just hurled insults towards each other over the music and regularly screamed about how they needed a singer. Luckily, one particularly specky individual named Milo Ackerman had recently become a big fan of the band and subsequently spent much of his time hanging out with the band and watching them rehearse. During a particular rehearsal session, Frank would grow so sick of singing the songs, he screamed out to get Milo to sing instead. Milo had been waiting for this moment for weeks. He jumped out of his chair and began singing. Little did the rest of the band know, Milo would become the catalyst for much of their later success. They began performing together, with specifically Milo becoming a powerful force within the Los Angeles punk scene. Although the entire band didn't exactly fit the punk ethos aesthetically, nobody embodied this more than Milo. He would perform to rabid punk and hardcore crowds whilst wearing thick-rimmed glasses and singing with his hand in his back pocket. At the time, most hardcore singers were trying to be masculine and macho, singing aggressively about politically charged topics. Although this was definitely appealing to many fans, most hardcore kids at the time were able to relate to a prepubescent nerd more so than a jacked Roblox character with anger issues and tattoos. Milo wasn't the only member that was able to make an impact. Bassist Tony Lombardo consistently played incredibly powerful 8th note downstrokes, resulting in prominent bass lines, taking the bass guitar away from the background and presenting it as a more integral part of the music than just the low-end instruments that followed the root notes of the guitar. This inspired the likes of Mark Hoppus of the eventual Blink-182. Around this time, they began the production of their first album, which was given the title Milo Goes to College by Frank. Milo was an incredibly smart kid and had two main goals in life, one of which was of course being a punk rock superstar, and the other was being a scientist, specifically within biochemistry. His passion for science led him down an educational path, with the production of Milo Goes to College coming just before he had planned to leave for further education. The band literally thought they were going to lose Milo to college. The production of the album came with literally zero strategy. They just picked a collection of their favourite songs that they had produced from their countless hours of rehearsing together and just slapped them together in an album. The final product would be released in 1982, with the eventual artwork featuring the iconic Milo logo. At the time, the band members had a high school friend named Roger, who spent much of his time at school doodling little heads on his books. One of these doodles would be based on Milo, with Roger creating a comic named Mishaps of Milo, centering around Milo's absent-minded genius personality and featuring this little doodle. The drawing became a way to taunt Milo, essentially just a way to easily piss him off. During the production of the album, Bill demanded the doodle be drawn for the cover art, with the eventual image being Milo in a shirt and tie, as that's what they thought people at college would wear. This logo has become iconic throughout the decades since, reaching a similar level to the Misfit skull or 4 lines utilized by Black Flag. Music-wise, each song on the project will be written by a different member, with one of the highlights, Suburban Home, basing its lyricism around Tony's hippie parents and how he didn't want to live his life in dirty hippie pads, juxtaposing the typical punk attitude at the time. When the recording of the album wrapped up, Milo did in fact leave for college to pursue his dream of becoming a scientist. Upon joining college, Milo was unable to live in university dorms and instead lived in the spare room of a family home outside of campus. A few months had passed since Descendants had finished the album, and Milo had never even heard the final product, and wasn't even aware of when it was going to be released to the public. His first listen came when an individual he lived with knocked on his door and invited him to listen to his copy of Milo Goes to College he had just bought on vinyl. With the lead singer of Descendants leaving for college, the band went on an extended hiatus, with Bill joining Black Flag as their drummer for a period of time. His experience with Black Flag alongside an insane work ethic developed his skills on the drum kit massively, and although he was actively a part of a very popular punk band, all he wanted to do was reflect these new skills onto Descendants songs. As the story goes, near the end of Bill's tenure with Black Flag, he would invite Milo to do some backing vocals for the Black Flag song Loose Nut. During the session, he would quietly show Milo a few songs he had written specifically for Descendants. Milo liked the songs so much, he decided to start singing for the band once again. They managed to get a hold of bassist Tony, who agreed to rejoin the band. There was just one problem. A few months earlier, Frank Navata had placed all of his music equipment in a huge pile, set it on fire and moved to Oregon, resulting in Ray Cooper replacing him on the guitar. They immediately began working on I Don't Want to Grow Up, with the band learning and recording the album in just 2 weeks. The quick turnover resulted in the band later admitting that they played the songs much better live than what was reflected on the recorded version. Bill had gotten a taste of touring whilst playing with Black Flag and wanted the same fate for Descendants. He immediately left Black Flag and planned a full US tour for Descendants. Unfortunately, Tony Lombardo was nearing 40 at the time. He had just bought a house, he had a full-time job and a fiancée. He wasn't prepared to give that all up to tour with a group of musicians 15 years younger than him. He subsequently left the band. According to later interviews, he has regretted the decision ever since. Luckily, Bill knew a bassist from school and decided to invite him to Descendants in the most way possible. He literally just kept leaving unsigned notes on the eventual new bassist Doug Carrion's door. This new lineup would perform together for a year or so and recorded and released the album Enjoy. Despite relative success, Doug and Ray quickly left the band to pursue new things, essentially becoming niche Descendant history NPCs. Although the new members were short-lived, their departure still left Bill and Milo without a band entirely. Bill immediately rang up a friend asking him to join as a bassist. Although the friend turned down the offer, luckily the phone call would be overheard by Carl Alvarez, who just happened to be a Descendants superfan. He immediately jumped on the opportunity to join the band. Upon learning that his childhood friend Carl had joined Descendants, guitarist Stephen Egerton rang him up to congratulate, only to learn by the end of this phone call that he was also going to join Descendants as their new guitarist. This new lineup had incredible chemistry straight off the bat, perhaps due to the fact that the two new members rehearsed their respective instruments to Descendants music for years. Shortly after the formation of the new lineup, the band were briefly signed to Greg Ginn's SST Records and moved to what they labelled as Descendants HQ, which in reality was just a shitty storefront with 3 bunk beds and a practice space. The band began working together on their new album entitled All. The concept of the album would be thought up by Bill whilst on a fishing trip. He defined the concept of All as doing as much as possible to receive as much as possible and never being happy with becoming stagnant. Although the concept was originally a joke, it quickly became a rule to live by for the band, inspiring the title of their next album. Shortly after the release of All, Milo left the band once again to return to biochemistry. He had never seen a music career as a viable option financially and always preferred keeping it as a hobby. This sentiment, combined with a couple of years of touring and horrendous sleeping arrangements for essentially no money at all, led him to focus on his other passion once again, although this time it wasn't clear if Milo would ever return to Descendants. This left remaining band members in a panic. Not only had they lost their lead singer, but their entire branding. They essentially had no choice but to end Descendants, resulting in the formation of the band All. All essentially just became Bill Stevenson's passion project, with him having full creative control. He was so excessively meticulous that he would force new singer Dave Smalley to repeat songs for 8 hours straight. According to Smalley, during one particular session, he requested a break to eat food after 8 hours of being forced to consistently sing the same song. Bill left and returned with a Snickers bar. He taped it to the studio window and told Smalley he could have it when he was finished. Although all consisted of essentially the exact same members as Descendants, nobody knew who the f they were, with the imagery and appeal of Milo carrying much of their popularity prior to this point. The negative aspects of this, combined with consistent touring with little to no break, led to original singer Dave Smalley leaving the band shortly after. In true Descendants fashion, the next singer for all, Scott Reynolds, was homeless at the time and had been living in his car outside the Descendants practice space for a few months. Upon realizing this homeless person had a beautiful voice, all quickly anointed him their new singer. Although Reynolds was essentially living his dream by being able to sing with a touring band, the prior impact of Milo began to weigh on him. All were receiving very little attention, and as a result decided to play Descendants songs live to try to appeal to their old fan base. This led to Reynolds consistently being verbally harassed by audience members, complaining that he wasn't Milo. This lack of success obviously led to a lack of money, which meant Los Angeles was no longer financially viable for the band. They knew they wanted to tour as much as possible, so saw it most convenient to move slap bang in the middle of the United States. This led to the band relocating to Missouri. The new location led to a huge influx in the band's workflow, resulting in plenty of new music. There was just one problem, however. The band struggled to find a consistent sound. They were all talented, unique musicians in their own right, meaning each idea put forward led to drastically different sounding songs, most of which failed to connect with audience members. This all began to grind on Scott Reynolds, who decided he wanted to be creatively free and left the band. Unfortunately, once again, all were without a singer, although fortunately, once again, they would find their new singer in another unlikely place. Chad Smith was a huge fan of All, and formed a friendship with the members a few months prior. Chad was a very quiet and humble guy, and kept secret the fact that he was an amazing singer for months. When the band realized, they didn't hesitate to bring him in as a singer. What happened next was blah 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 1993, blah 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 Nirvana, blah blah blah, labels were willing to throw money at any motherfucker with a guitar. This influx in label attention resulted in All being signed to Interscope for the production of their next record, Pummel, in 1995. Unfortunately, these labels likely had zero clue of who All even were, and just saw dollar bills in anyone that may slightly resemble Cobain, meaning their relationship quickly fizzled out and All was signed to Epitaph shortly after. Luckily, the band had experience and had reached a certain level of maturity by this point, meaning the influx of money from the labels didn't just immediately go towards higher quality coffee or some other substance, which happened in the case of most other bands at the time. They actually invested in a professional recording studio named The Blasting Room, which has later been stated as being the best decision they had ever made as a band. All were just off the tails of their tour supporting the album Pummel, and were preparing to get right back in the studio and continue working alongside their new label Epitaph. Little did they know an old friend was about to rear his sneaky head once again. Milo approached Bill with a bunch of songs he had written during his hiatus from the band, expressing a willingness to take a break from biochemistry and return to punk rock. The band immediately called Epitaph and asked them if they wanted to do a Descendants album instead of an All album. I can only assume the label representative fell to the floor in disbelief and started maniacally laughing at the thought of all the Milo-themed merchandise. He immediately agreed. Although Descendants were back, the band didn't actually kick out Chad, instead deciding to work on All and Descendants at the same time in order to not f**k anybody over. Unlike most artists or bands, Descendants have remained friendly and kept an open working relationship with the vast majority of former bandmates throughout their career, which meant their next album, Everything Sucks, would feature efforts from OG members Frank and Tony, as well as All member Chad. Upon release, Everything Sucks would perform much better than expected, which was thanks to the musical landscape at the time. Bands like Bad Religion, NoFX, Green Day and Pennywise are at the top of the mountain in terms of countercultural music and receiving real mainstream attention. It just so happens that the vast majority of these bands cited Descendants as a huge influence. Suddenly, the pioneers of pop-punk were playing amongst the individuals they had influenced, at a time where their creation was seeing real mainstream popularity popularity, they were embraced by the punk community once again, resulting in Descendents playing to bigger crowds than ever before. This small reunion lasted for about a year before Milo would once again hibernate within his biochemistry hole. The band returned to focusing their entire efforts on All, riding off of the success of Descendents' brief return with the release of All's most popular project to date, Mass Murder. They decided to focus on an entirely different strategy in terms of All concerts. Instead of attempting to headline shows and appealing to old Descendents fans, they instead supported the pop-punk bands of the time, focusing on building an entirely new audience. This would work to a point, although it was clear All was unable to receive the same commercial success as Descendents, which says a lot about Milo as a lead singer and brand. Not only did Milo connect with people through his look and persona, he reminded fans of a nostalgic past within the 80s when Descendents first started. All had simply become the band that were guilty of not being Descendents. The crowds slowly began to get smaller, with each band member finding themselves with family members they had to support. They realized it wasn't working anymore and stopped touring entirely in 2002. In the following years, the members still sent music to Bill with the intention of eventually recording together again, although Bill's lack of response and enthusiasm began to be seen as strange. It's as if Bill had lost all of his personality and was slowly putting on weight, spacing out, and just sitting in front of the television instead of producing music within the blasting room. Not long after this, Bill was admitted to hospital after receiving a foot-long blood clot within his lungs. Somehow he actually survived and returned home. Despite healing up from the blood clot, Bill still seemed to have lost his personality, and upon returning to the doctor for a checkup, it became obvious that Bill had a benign tumor in his brain that had been growing for years. The tumor was so large it was pushing against his frontal lobes, essentially removing his personality. They were able to do surgery and remove the tumor, meaning in the space of just 1 year, Bill Stevenson had survived 2 life-threatening conditions and subsequenting surgeries. Upon waking up from the brain surgery, Bill screamed at the top of his lungs. You'd imagine this was in pain, as he had just had brain surgery, but no, he was screaming in joy because suddenly he had regained his full personality and was finally back to normal. He returned home and immediately called Milo. He had a lust for life again and wanted to play music immediately. Milo noticed how much debt Bill was in as a result of the medical bills, land of the free, and returned to Descendents to play some shows. Since 2008, Descendents have continued to stay together as a band. The band have released an album consisting of new material named Hypercaphium Spazonate, and more recently a project consisting of material from the 80s known as Ninth and Walnut. They have also continued with their coffee habit, with Bill drinking 20 espressos not long after receiving open heart surgery. To this day, the band continue to play regular shows, most recently supporting NoFX for their final tour. Descendents are perhaps the best example of how a group of individuals staying true to themselves within music can result not only in truly influential songs, but a legacy that dwarfs some of the most prominent names in punk. The group have never seen music as a business or a way to make money, spending the vast majority of their career playing for dirt money during a time period where punk was not financially viable in the slightest. Despite this, they never changed their style to appeal to more people, leading to them creating music that musically and lyrically inspired some of the biggest artists within pop punk, the most prominent obviously being Blink-182. It can easily be argued that their immature lyricism combined with their melodic, blisteringly fast brand of hardcore essentially created pop punk, and it can also be argued that they somewhat inspired grunge, with Dave Grohl of Nirvana learning drums by whacking pillows with drumsticks in time to Milo Goes to College. Turns out the perfect chemical equation for influential music is a group of freaks who refuse to fit themselves into even the outcast nature of punk, childhood bullying that results in emotionally charged lyricism, and of course enough coffee to make playing a punk song about eating burgers at the speed of 198 BPM feel slow.